All right, welcome back to Bass Feed. This is Braden. We're going to go over a little bit more detail on how I go about catching some bigger largemouth in summertime. So I'm going to use a little bit of a different format that may or may not be easier for you guys to understand. It's surely going to feel easier for me to explain. So let's get into it. So I always target bigger largemouth, and that is my number one goal when I'm out fishing in the summer or anytime for that matter. I'm going to go over 5 different locations that work really well for me when I'm looking for a big largemouth. So the first is generally known, and I don't believe I need to go into great detail, but I'll just briefly touch on it. So let's just start with a little side view. This is a side view of the lake, and we'll call that the shore. And we'll just play around and call this the boat. And let's do the water line next. And there's the water line. So for the sake of explaining this, we'll say that this is about 15 feet. And this is about 25 feet. So the first area that everybody kind of knows is shallow cover. Everyone and their mom knows the best place to target bass, generally speaking, is up shallow. We're talking docks, pilings, trees laying out on the water that fell down. And these fish like to set up on shallow cover in general. Now, everyone knows about that, so I'm not going to spend too much time diving in. I will briefly explain the baits that I use during summertime. And that is, generally speaking, separated into 3 categories. One is topwater. Frog or something faster moving like a buzzbait, whopper plopper are great options. And now, first off, topwater is great. You can go over cover, and that's what's so great about topwater. You can work it over some limbs, and these fish can be hiding right under, come up and smash. It even works well on docks and that sort of thing. Now, I don't throw a ton of topwater, and that's just me, and I know guys have a lot of luck. The times I throw topwater are when I have like an algae bloom in certain areas of the lake that's closer to shore. These fish like to hide under that algae bloom, and they feel very secure. Yeah, topwater over the top, some frog over the top of even those small lilies, weeds, any sort of wood cover, and especially algae blooms. I don't pass one algae bloom without tossing a frog. I always have a frog tied on, and it is really fun when it gets working. Other than that, so let's say we got some weeds here on the edge. Generally, besides topwater, there's 2 different categories I throw. It's something that drops a little faster, something that drops a little slower. And slower sometimes works when faster, and vice versa. When I throw slower dropping baits, it's weightless Senko, a small jig head with like a little swim bait, and could be a fluke with a small weight or no weight. You could do a weightless fluke. That is a real good way to target these fish. And something faster, that's punching, flipping, pitching. in general. And if you're in the cover, great. If you're out of the cover, same thing. Sometimes these fish like king on something that drops very quickly in front of them, and you're getting more of a reaction bite at that point. So that's as far into the details as I'll go on shallow shoreline fishing. Now, not always is that bite going to be that great. And the next best spot that I'll throw at, generally speaking, these weedy lakes, starting at about, could be, 8 feet, could be 10 feet, somewhere in there, weeds will thrive in a certain area, a certain depth from the shore. So this inside weed line here, there'll be a void in between the weeds and the shoreline, and a lot of times these fish will stage on this inside weed line. And if you don't see them on your electronics or visually, they'll often be right in that inside weed line, waiting for a bait to swim by, and they'll come out and ambush. So that's a great spot. So this is the second spot, inside weed lines in general. If you have additional cover or structure in this area, even better. And at that point, I'll typically I'll toss at the shallow cover, drag all the way down, and then rip it out of these weeds on this inside weed line, and they'll come out and strike on the wind. So you're actually covering two areas at the same time in one cast. And that's what I used to do all the time before I utilized my electronics, because you could visually see the weeds here, and oftentimes it's very defined. You just see where the top of these weeds end and begins. And that's great for y'all that either don't know how to use your electronics or just don't have electronics. And visually, you can find these little areas and fish them just like that. Now, a lot of my success is over time. I have found certain areas of the lake that I know are populated. So if they're not out here, then I know they're in the weeds or on the inside weed line. So generally speaking, that's a whole different discussion, is finding these areas that do hold fish and then determining where they're staging. If you don't know and you just need to cover ground, I think a good way to do that is running a chatterbait, a buzzbait, or crankbait, something that's moving pretty quickly. And that only works on select bites for the most part, but it's a good way to cover ground and to start getting bit in certain areas, so you know at least where fish are gathering. And these fish will school up, generally speaking. So always note where you catch a fish, and definitely revisit that area, because odds are there are more fish in that area. Okay, so you got shore fishing, inside weed line. The next best spot, which I've been focusing a lot this year, and you'll see in quite a few of these clips, they will stage on the outside weed line. And oftentimes they're just inside the weeds. And even if you have forward-facing sonar, you can't see them. Even when you use any electronics, you can't see them. You'll see the weeds. But generally speaking, once you learn your lakes and you know which areas hold fish, they will be on that outer weed line in little groups oftentimes, and there would be a great way to target these bigger ones. I caught a lot of big fish on these outer weed lines. Now, when I'm doing that, obviously, depending on the depth here, if this is 10 feet or less, then you can still use a slow dropping bait. And that's basically the same baits I explained when targeting shallow cover. It takes a little more patience, but when you know you're on the fish, sometimes that's just how you got to get bit. Now, I got third place in my last tournament. I was just throwing slow dropping baits along weed lines, and that did the trick for me. Now, when you get any more than like 10 feet, it's not a practical option unless you 100% know there's fish staging in those particular spots. Other than that, you really don't want to throw slow dropping baits or slow moving baits like a drop shot or like a weightless Senko or fluke or a light creature or just anything slow dropping. It's just going to take too much time to cover water. Fortunately for me, I have studied these lakes that I'm on, so I know there's fish in these certain areas generally, so I can slow it down. So in a lot of my clips, you will see me using finesse type baits or slow dropping baits, but that doesn't mean that is the end all choice for that particular circumstance. You might want to use something that drops quickly, like a heavier jig, a half ounce or something. Drop it on the front of these weed lines here, this outer weed line. Or like a weighted creature is another favorite of mine when I'm covering water. Just drop it, drag it, pop it around these weeds. And sometimes these fish are staged right on the outside, and that makes it easy to locate with electronics, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're easy to catch. But what I have found over the years is when you're on a tough bite, this is especially for y'all forward-facing sonar folks, if you're having trouble getting these fish to bite that you're finding out in the open, there's no easy way to fix that problem. You could throw different baits and try to get them dialed in, but a lot of times, even though it's as tempting as hell just to keep tossing at those fish, they sometimes will not bite unless they're feeling very secure in their spots. So surrounded by cover. And so when you're struggling with those fish out in the open, throw closer. Even if you see the fish out here, throw literally into the weeds. And what'll happen is generally speaking, these fish are actually scattered out here and in the weeds. But these fish are much more likely to bite than the fish that are out in the open. So if you're just struggling like hell and they won't even hit like a drop shot or anything finesse, focus on the cover. And that goes for shallow shore fishing as well. This area right here, same thing. Tight to cover. Sometimes you only get bit when you skip under docks. It's the same type of deal. When they're absolutely covered by cover or structure, then they are much likelier to bite. Now I'm referring to big fish. This is kind of a big fish idea, big fish tutorial, because that's what I focus on. Little fish will often bite. They'll just keep biting. Even when they're out in the open, even when you're off this cover, you'll notice you'll get little bites, but I'm talking big bites. When you just can't get these big ones to commit, throw into cover. Right into it. And that is a big tip. I cannot overstate how important that is when you're on a tough bite. Okay, so we got 1, 2, 3 spots that we've gone over. And for the most part, those are the baits I like throwing. I guess my favorite 2 baits for this type of fishing would be a jig, whether it's a bladed jig or just a run-of-the-mill jig, throwing it around the edge of the weed line and getting them to react. Oftentimes, you could throw into the weeds, rip it out. That's when you'll get hit. And if you don't get hit right there, you'll feel it. You're tugging, trying to get out of these weeds. And then you could kind of feel when you're just burst out of the weeds. soon as you feel that jig come loose, you finally pop it out and it's free. Open your bail. Let that drop straight down. And even when you don't get hit up here, these fish are often all along that weed edge and or at the base of the weed line. And that's a very good way of getting bit. Works very consistently for me. So when you're struggling out here or shore fishing, just start and you can cover ground doing that, and especially if you're not in a monstrous lake, you can pick apart these weed lines pretty quickly, relatively quickly, with some sort of weighted craw or a weighted creature, a weighted swim bait, or a jig. Now, colors all depends on water clarity, and a ton of other fishermen go over colors. I'm not going to dive real deep into it, but in general, clear water, natural colors; dirty water, dark. I am all about black and blue, and it works all the way. I mostly use that in the spring, but I'll use it in dirty water all summer long, and it gets bit. And you've probably seen in some of my clips or many of my clips that's what I throw. Okay, so we covered 1, 2, 3 of the 5 spots. Now another good area to target: offshore cover and structure. Now this is mostly for smallmouth, but also works really well for largemouth, especially in eastern Washington. These fish will actually stage, whether you see them on electronics or not. They'll be down in those boulders, stumps, anything like that offshore, just outside the weed line. Even better when they relate to each other, because those fish like areas where they have cover in the mid-range and deep, because they'll shift back and forth. I watch these fish very closely. They'll be out here one day, and when they're just not there, they are right there, whether you can see them or not. And they'll swim back and forth. Oftentimes in the morning when it's cooler, they're feeding on these weeds. And then when it gets hot, I've just noticed this a few times. This may not be consistent, but worth a look. But when it gets hot, they'll slide deeper and they'll be roaming out here and feeding. So by afternoon, I'll go back to these same spots where I was catching them on the weed line. They will now be out and about, cruising in small groups, looking for bait fish, craw, that sort of thing. And so, yeah, that basically covers that. Now, it's a little bit different set of baits that I use for this offshore stuff. Let's just say that's your same outer weed line here. So your covers out here, or you got stumps, let's say you have stumps out here, or tree limbs like this, or logs, laydowns, whatever you want to call it. They will be out here on this stuff. And you need to get down deep to get to these fish. We're talking, this could be up to 25 feet, generally speaking. Eastern Washington, I find that they're a little deeper. Western Washington, I don't really go that deep when I'm focusing on largemouth. Maybe 18 plus, maybe 15 plus. And this all works just the same, just a little bit, not as deep, and which is great because it's a little less area to cover when trying to cover water. Now, baits. I love throwing a wobblehead because you could drag this in, boat's over here, and you're making that ground contact. Because when you rip it through boulders and wood, when that kind of pops through is when you get bit. These big ones are smart. They don't just bite whatever you throw at them. You got to get a little bit more reaction. And that could be wobblehead, depending on the depth is your size, but regardless of what you throw, wobblehead could be football head jig, regular jig, whatever it is, heavy enough to, while you're reeling slowly, you're dragging and hitting the bottom as you're reeling in. So that needs to be pretty heavy if you're fishing these depths. So keep that in mind. If you're reeling and you're not feeling the bottom at all, even when you're reeling slow, your bait's probably cruising like this. You will get bites here and there, but that's not what you want to be doing. You want to be dragging through that stuff. I mean, it's trouble because you're going to get snagged, but that's where the fish are, and that's where you're going to get your bigger bites. So I do a weighted creature, football head jig, wobble head, deep crank, even a heavy, really heavy bladed jig would be good, because then you can kind of rip it. When you're feeling it on the bottom and you're getting close to that cover, you can just rip it. You can rip it right over the head of these fish and they'll come up and smash it. So that is another good spot. Now, the last spot I'll go over. So there you go, lures and area to fish. You may need to use your electronics to find this cover. Even if you only have traditional sonar, or side imaging is a little better, you're covering a little more ground when you're looking, you can locate some of these spots. It just takes a little practice. And once you find these spots, get some baits that get down there and pull through those areas. Okay, that pretty much covers that. I'm not trying to make a long video, but I have a lot to go over here. So the one last spot, this is a really fun way to fish, and this also works for smallmouth too. Vertical cover. You can get pilings, subsurface pilings. You have to use electronics oftentimes, unless you see the top of something while you're visually scanning. You have to use electronics to find this type of cover, but this is money, especially in Eastern Washington. You could have a submerged tree, piling, or even like a bigger stump, even weed piles, even big old weed piles that are isolated that just happen to be growing vertically. These are very key spots, and I cannot tell you how many fish I have found offshore, and these are the bigger fish. So if you're getting good and you have the ability to find this offshore stuff, oftentimes the biggest fish in the lake will be there. You have a handful scattered, oftentimes isolated in shallow cover, but you'll find them in groups offshore, especially if you have forward-facing sonar. You can locate, you're not just finding the cover. You can actually see if there's fish on them. Oftentimes, a lot of times, those fish are so sucked up to that cover, you can't even see them even if you had forward-facing sonar. I mean, they're in this stuff. You don't see them until you either get bit or you're watching your baits go through these areas on your sonar, and you can see them just kind of rise up out of these areas. Okay, now we know the where. We want to know what baits work well. Now, I like drop shot, but I've noticed in summertime these big fish are really keying in on bigger baits. So drop shot's great. If you're going to drop shot, use like a bigger worm, like a 6-inch, or something with a little bit more to it, because oftentimes these fish will absolutely ignore my finesse baits. And that's when I know I'm sitting on big largemouth. They will not even move an inch at a little bait, which is almost the opposite of what I do to catch these offshore smallmouth. So completely different game. I'll throw the opposite, the other end of the spectrum. I will throw big baits. And if the distance between the top of the cover and the water line is only, I would say, less than 8 feet, I'm all about the top water offshore. A walking bait, even a whopper plopper, a popper. These fish are often looking up. For whatever reason on this vertical cover, they are looking up for sure. And if you're struggling with those fish, that might be what you're missing. So they're always looking up. And you could even do a swim bait, swim jig, because it has a little bit more size to it. And what's great about this, swim it above that cover, and you don't have to worry about getting snagged. And let those fish come to you. That way you're not having to get in this mess. I can't tell you how many times you get in this mess, you wreck your spot, you break off, you're down a lure, no bueno. Let these fish come to you. Okay, so we covered top water. Subsurface baits work really well too. You could do like a wake bait, glide bait, swim jig, even just a little ball head like a Demiki, and just kind of jerk a Demiki over the top of these. If they're not keen on big baits, that's a good way to induce a strike. Jerk bait, yep, jerk bait along the top of this. Generally speaking, just know they're looking up. Again, if you focus on drop shot, just hit the edges if you can, because that's a mess, and nobody likes retying drop shot. Too many knots. So just throw on the outside of these spots and just hope these fish don't bring you right back in when you're fighting them, because I throw a lot of light gear. It's a shame losing a big fish in some offshore cover. I try to stay focused on the water column above them. Money. I'll even throw big swim baits too, like a Huddleston, a Megabass, Mag Draft, and anything like that will get their attention. They will. It has drawing power. When you use a big bait, they will come up sometimes 10 to 15 feet. So you may feel silly throwing something way up there when they're in the deep, but they will come up for it. The only thing you'll have to remember on that is you need to set up your boat as far away as possible from this cover and throw behind the cover, bring it back to you. The reason I say this is they'll follow this bait sometimes 30 feet this way before they bite it. You want as much time before you get that bait to the boat as possible to give those fish a chance to follow for 10, 15, 20 feet and then hit it. If you're right on top of it, those fish will just swim up, see your boat, and they are gone. And they just won't bite after that oftentimes, especially on a tough bite. So keep that in mind. So that should cover it. I hope I didn't spend too much time on this video, but that should give you a good idea how to target these bigger fish. And I think I mixed it up a little bit in there. So for some advanced tips for those forward-facing sonar guys, and some beginner tips of generally knowing which areas to target. Oh, one last thing I think I'll mention. If you are using forward-facing sonar and you see bait on the outside of a weed line and you don't see bass, or you don't think you see bass, they are almost guaranteed to be in the weeds, outside weed line, waiting for these little fish to slip up and they'll come out and smash. So if you target the weeds behind the bait, you could get some big bites in there. So I think that covers it, guys, and I hope this little different way of explaining things is a little more helpful for you guys, and I hope it makes sense to you in terms of the layout. It does to me, because I look at my sonar a lot, and this is how the forward-facing sonar is set up when you're looking at it. So this is, in my mind, a good way to explain what I'm seeing, how I see the fish reacting, and what I throw. So You know, these are some big tips and work really well. And as long as you put them to good work and find these populated areas and do just that, you should start getting into some big fish. I think in my next video, I'll show, without spoiling it completely, I'll show you where these fish are going into fall and how the strategy changes slightly. So I'll go over that in another video. Since these videos are a little easier for me to do, not a ton of clips or time in the water, I might be able to do a little bit more of these videos without, just having the ability to put out more videos would be great. I am super busy. This is the busiest fall I've ever had. I mean, summer too. I mean, work is just crazy. I manage 26 guys, and it's a handful, and I'm generally busy all the time. And when I have free time, I want to go fish. I don't want to make videos. I want to go have fun. And when I'm not having fun, I'm with my family. So this is sort of the last on the totem pole when it comes to prioritizing my time. If I got a little bit more feedback from making videos, if I get enough subscribers and enough followers and have a way of monetizing it, I'd be happy to take away time from other things to create more videos, but I just don't have the motivation at this stage. This is almost more for fun. I like making videos and I like fishing, and I'm really good at catching big fish. So it just makes sense to me that I spend time making videos. So that's where I'm at in this, and I would love to get into this a little more, but I'm going to need your guys' help for that. So definitely share, like, or subscribe, and that'll help me a lot. The faster I could get that feedback, the more videos I can start pumping out. Good luck to you guys, and if you guys have any questions, leave it down in the comments, and I will answer your questions and or make a video in response to your requests. All right, appreciate it, guys. I will check in with you on the next video.